In 1938, Marcello Clerici is a young and secretly troubled Italian man who is navigating the fascist dictatorship in Italy. He is assigned to supervise the assassination of his old college philosophy professor and known anti-fascist Luca Quadri. Bernardo Bertolucci's fifth feature film, The Conformist, is an Italian, French, and Western German co-production released in 1970. The project was based upon the 1951 novel of the same name, a modern Greek tragedy where cyclical inevitability and journeys of fate and destiny are central to the protagonist. The use of 1930s fascist art decor, costume and set design, and a concentrated employment of lighting and framing work to fully immerse the film spectatorship within a stylish and unexpected world. The dreamy aesthetic structure of the film places the spectator in Marcello's mind, and they experience his past as he recounts it. The film uses a car ride from Paris to Savoy as its present tense, and Marcello's secreted memories and repressed desires interrupt the narrative throughout. The compelling story of a man wrestling with unresolved personal traumas as he desperately tries to hold on to his daily facade of normalcy and convention. Through flashbacks, the audience learns about Marcello's commitment to the fascist party and the moments leading up to his assignment to murder Quadri. The small space of the car traps Marcello within its borders, a human story of extreme desire and unwavering resistance that leaves one pondering, why do we rely on other people and their perception of us? Isn't the obsession with conformity keeping us locked inside of the same borders we are afraid to stay within? The roadmap of my exploration through The Conformist begins with the filmmaking approach and some background on the creation of this boundary-challenging story of an identity in crisis. This virtual essay will investigate the film on narrative, thematic, and aesthetic levels. It will expand into Vittorio Storaro's cinematography in the film and his employment of lighting, composition, and set design. I will also address how the coarse content of Italian desire and resistance weaves its way through this political drama and the character of Marcello Clerici. The inner contradictions of the characters in The Conformist are somewhat a reflection of Bertolucci's own personal conflicts, specifically in his interesting and strained relationships to fascism and his own father. He recalled that, quote, his own father was anti-fascist, but obviously I feel that the whole bourgeoisie is my father, and fascism was invented by the petite bourgeoisie. End quote. Golden 66. Bertolucci's own confusing past and early desires for the structured societal traditions of family and parental guidance manifest themselves in his main character of Marcello, specifically in flashback scenes of his troubled youth. The dreams through flashback scenes serve as a visually sensational look into Marcello's unconscious, his childhood memories, and his deepest and most resistant desires, with his passive aggression and an abnormal identification of sexuality. The dramatic employment of lighting and playful use of composition are two of the Conformist's biggest aesthetic strengths and conveyors of these thematic messages. In the opening shot of the film, the beating of a red light illuminates Marcello as the sun seemingly comes up. The employment of lighting in The Conformist is complex and surprising. It is neutral but at times vibrant in its color. It is full of extreme contrasts, sharp lines, and an appreciation of space and darkness. In this shot, Professor Quadri recounts Marcello's idea to use the lesson of the prisoners of Plato as his master thesis before Quadri fled to France in exile. The looming betrayal of Marcello is exacerbated by the reliance on stark contrasts in light, a heavy use of darkness that is familiar to film noir genres and themes of moral corruption. The utilization of natural sunlight during the day to primarily light certain scenes can be exemplified in a shot like this, as the camera picks up the streams of light through the overcast and trees. The haunting beauty behind this lighting choice is its juxtaposition with the brutal betrayal and murder of the Quadris by the men who were descending out of the forest. There are several scenes where a combination of natural and artificial light is used off-camera to create shadows, lines, and even shapes within the frame. The harsh lines and stark contrast in the lighting design create the illusion of imprisonment and thus serve as a reflection of Marcello's inner psychology and suppressed identity. The use of light and shadows contribute to the dreamlike and aesthetic approach to the narrative. In this shot, Marcello's shadow is visible in a large and empty room as he runs up the staircase. Or as he speaks to Julia in their apartment, streams of light illuminate the room, and a statue of a woman's face casts a shadow on the wall behind him. The cinematographer Vittorio Storaro recalled using the light in such a sharp way that there is, quote, no harmony or embrace between light and shadows, end quote. The lines of light and darkness trap Marcello within their patterns and foreshadow his self-deception and moral corruption, but also the inescapable and inevitable nature of his pathway forward. Marcello's superego has been repressing his unconscious desires for his entire adulthood. His dreams are a way of his mind releasing some of his inner burning. Giulia's mother is captured in a similar lighting scheme in this shot. The lighting here could be used to create a visually disjointed and or incomplete room or space and signify the character's inner conflicts in some way. In other scenes, the primary source of light is coming from on screen. For example, the ceiling fixture in the hallway as Marcello looks at the back of Anna's head. Shots including the bright practical lights. Additional lighting is used to accentuate other lines or characters within the shot, but is usually minimal. An example of this would be the extra light coming from the top and accentuating the rim of Marcello's hat and the back of Anna's hair. This shot of Agent Maniello and Marcello in the restaurant is another example of a practical lamp within the frame as it primarily lights the two subjects, and the backlights from the kitchen illuminate the staff in the background. The tension in this scene is more effective because of the swinging and disorienting nature of the yellow fixture. Just like the lighting in The Conformist, camera composition and framing in the film are constantly working to engage the audience and communicate the story in numerous ways. In addition to every decision being purposeful, the camera work often confuses a spectator and even attempts to show you the world through the character's perspective at times. For example, in this eerie shot through the car window of Anna looking through a professor, often the characters are photographed in vast rooms, vacant spaces, or wide landscapes. Storaro and Bertolucci frame the subjects in spaces that have an undeniable and looming presence, threatening to engulf them. In this scene, Marcello is surrounded by the partygoers as they happily dance around him in a circle. His isolation from the others is apparent in this scene, as his ability to conform to social traditions such as dancing visually separates him from the social circle he is in and the culture that Giulia and the others are so comfortable with. The deliberate spacing of certain characters to suggest social hierarchies, the usage of frames within frames, and the reliance on lines and visual borders are some of the characteristics of the following shots. An interesting moment happens when the camera zooms out to reveal Giulia's face in a wedding gown as Marcello confesses his many sins to his pastor. Marcello's search for atonement for his sins of murder and his role in homosexual seduction is visible in this scene in the church. You can identify with all three perspectives and see the relationship between them in a more dynamic way in this shot. Marcello becomes increasingly frustrated with Giulia's mentioning of the quadris in this seemingly simple scene on the couch. However, the lines still frame the two characters as a divided romantic unit. The Dutch or canted angle is used in many shots in the film, usually in order to disorient the viewer in some way or signify something unwelcome or askew. Seeing everything off balance makes spectators uneasy and therefore relating to this distorted state of mind of the main character. In this verbal confrontation between Marcello and Maniello, this visual language of the camera is working to allow the viewer to understand Marcello's askew perspective. Marcello's disrupted connection to his own father is a crucial piece of his decision-making throughout the film as well. Memories of a murderous father are investigated in a searing scene as Marcello visits him in an asylum. Here, you see Marcello and his mother standing over his father in a pyramid formation. The lines of the benches suggest the workings of oppression on Marcello by his father and superego, but even fascism itself. As he recalls childhood memories of his father boasting about torturing and murdering people while in the secret fascist police, Marcello, quote, abdicates personal responsibility for the crime he will commit by blaming his father for the chain reaction he has initiated, end quote, Rigoletto 137. Marcello admits to his moral upheaval by blaming it on a cycle started by his father. This moment of verbal retribution between Marcello and his father is symbolic of an, quote, inescapable connectedness between the destiny of father and son within Marcello's logic. Further, it is an event that marks Marcello's initial perception of the inevitability of his actions and their consequences, end quote, Rigoletto 137. Marcello's issues with his father stem from unresolved questions from his childhood. This flashback scene follows a young Marcello as he flees school bullies by catching a ride with a chauffeur named Lino. This over-the-shoulder shot immerses the spectator in a youthful and innocent Marcello's state of mind as he safely escapes harm, though it be briefly. This could be an example of Storaro using the camera as a surveillance device. The composition in much of the film frames Marcello as an outsider who is constantly trying to fit into the lines of society. Many shots show him against a wall, within doorways or windows, or in vast locations. Here are blendings of lighting and composition which play with the atmospheric tension in a scene. The hard lines and edges within the frames reflect restrictions of society and how they keep individuals from fulfilling their true desires. The visual borders suggest Marcello's conforming to cultural expectations and his dedication to damaging ideologies in order to maintain a facade of normal masculinity. Marcello has just shared important news with Maniello about the assassination plans. Maniello stares him down as his eyes glance at the incoming group of dancing partygoers. The sexual dynamics and different character perspectives can be seen in this artful shot in the brothel with Marcello, Maniello, and a prostitute with the face of Anna. Now, Marcello is living a seemingly conventional lifestyle with Giulia and their child. The cracks in his facade are finally visible to Giulia, and she confronts him about the high price of his career with the fascist police and the murder of the Quadris. Here, the psychological distance between them is visible in the division of the hallway and room. The murder of Luca and Anna Quadri solidifies Marcello's moral downfall and his, quote, attempt to escape his abnormality, Rigoletto 145. His mental distortion is also apparent underneath the arches of the Colosseum. After overhearing two men flirting and recognizing one to be Lino, the chauffeur who seduced him as a child and who he thought he had murdered, Marcello publicly berates and denounces his old friend, Italo. As he angrily calls Italo a fascist, Marcello realizes, quote, that the killing for which he had sought atonement had never occurred. The logic through which Marcello had been trying to escape his abnormality crumbles, end quote, Rigoletto 145. In this shot, Italo is seen in the foreground as Marcello points to a fleeing Lino, who he denounces as a homosexual fascist and responsible for the murder of Luca and Anna Quadri. Marcello is consistently resisting his own urges in order to conform to the rules that construct the surrounding culture, in his case, the political regime of fascism. In his desire to fit in and be normal, he ends up acting as a tool of war and embracing the ideologies of fascism. Clericci's journey is captured so beautifully, however, that it is difficult not to empathize with his perspective. In the end, we find Marcello reconciling his own illusions of identity and sexuality, but also facing the illusions of fascism and its, quote, authoritative hold on reality, Rigoletto 145. He must reconcile with the repression of his childhood desires and reflect on the constructed and empty life he has built in order to be secure from such perceived transgressions. Desire and resistance in the Conformist are shown through Marcello's inner femininity and conflicted identity. His true identity repeatedly threatens his version of normality and masculinity. The alluring and non-conformist style of the cinematography encapsulates him within a dreamscape that allows for the space of the subconscious mind to run wild. The manipulation of lighting and framing manifests an imaginative visual language that ultimately makes Bertolucci's political statements and criticisms feel more important and unforgettable. As the shadows or reflections of reality are drawn out of the room by the light from the window, Marcello's deceptive perspective is illuminated and he regains his vision. Unlike in the Oedipal story, where contradictions and desires resolve with closure, areas in which desire finds expression should be conceived of as more significant to cultural evolution and a reconstruction of binary systems of sexuality and gender. Laura Mulvey argues that this terrain of expressed desire provides, quote, an imagery of revolt against a patriarchal order, as well as an imagery of change, transformation, and liberation, end quote, Mulvey 174. The depth of his unconscious desires are explored in the visual storytelling achieved by Bertolucci and Storaro. By exposing the inconsistencies in Marcello's psychological state and the contradictions in his life, the film enables the audience to grapple with their own moral questions of politics, psychology, sexuality, and identity. The inevitability and ambiguity of Marcello's fate is foreshadowed in the arresting mise-en-scene, which allows the spectator to hope for clarity and happiness for Marcello, but also realize that he is destined to falter. In the final shot of the film, Marcello looks intently at a naked young man behind him, at the same time staring down the lens of the camera. The confrontation of Marcello's lonesome gaze suggests that in the act of covering himself up and creating a facade, he has uncovered himself even more and completely shattered his illusion of reality. The spaces of expressed desire Mulvey previously mentioned that are used in The Conformist provide a cinematic place, quote, in which the feminine, irremediably excluded from the deterministic linearity of the Oedipus complex, may re-emerge and suggest the possibility of resistance and disruption, end quote, Rigoletto 146. In his conflicting desires to follow social codes of sexuality and suppress his most innate impulses, Marcello is a male identity who is suffering with an irreparable inner division. A division within him that is familiar to individuals living in post-war Italy and other war-torn countries around the world.